The rain had turned Mayfair's cobblestones into mirrors, each one reflecting the golden glow of the Ashworth Gala's windows. Beatrice Halloway pressed herself against the damp brick of the stable-yard wall, her ruined silk gown clinging to her shivering frame, and held Pearl so tightly against her chest that she could feel the puppy's rapid heartbeat through the thin fabric of her bodice. "Just wait it proper," came the rough voice of her aunt's footman from around the corner. "The Thames don't give up what it takes. Lady Ashworth wants no trace of the creature by morning." Beatrice's breath caught. The world seemed to narrow to a pinpoint of horror. Pearl's soft white fur dampening against her throat, the puppy's trusting whimper, the casual cruelty in those words. Wait it proper. As though her beloved companion were nothing more than refuse to be disposed of. Her mind raced with the brutal arithmetic of her situation. She was alone. No friends at the gala would defy her aunt, the formidable Lady Constance Ashworth, who held Beatrice's meager inheritance in an iron grip. No servants would risk their positions to help a penniless niece. And if she ran, where could she go? The streets of London at midnight were no haven for a young woman with no coin and no protection. The stable-yard door creaked open. Beatrice's heart lurched. She had seconds, perhaps less. Then she saw it, the carriage rolling to a stop just beyond the gate. Even in the rain-blurred darkness, the crest was unmistakable. A raven with spread wings, worked in silver that seemed to gleam with its own cold light. The Ravenclife crest. She'd heard the whispers about him all evening, watched him from across the ballroom like everyone else did, from a safe distance. Alistair Burke, Duke of Ravenclife. The Iron Duke. A man so powerful that even her aunt's voice dropped to something approaching respect when his name was mentioned. The footsteps were closer now. Pearl whimpered again, sensing her terror. Beatrice moved without thinking. She couldn't think. Couldn't afford to think. Because thinking would mean accepting that what she was about to do was madness. The carriage door hung open, the step down waiting. The ducal footman had turned away to speak with the driver. 3 seconds. That's all she had. She ran, my beautiful family. Beatrice is seconds away from losing her only friend to the cold river. If you believe no animal deserves a fate like Pearl's, hit that subscribe button right now to show your support. Like and share this video. And before we see if she makes it into the carriage, subscribe and join our inner circle. Only the first 1,000 members get to be part of our founding family before the door closes forever. Now, let's get into the story. Beatrice's slippers made no sound on the wet stone. Pearl, bless her, seemed to understand the need for silence and buried her small face into Beatrice's neck. The carriage loomed before her like a cathedral, all gleaming black lacquer and burgundy velvet within. She threw herself inside, pulled the door closed with trembling fingers, and dove for the floor. There was a heavy fur rug folded on the bench seat. Wolf, by the feel of it, thick and dark. Beatrice dragged it over herself and Pearl, creating a den of shadows and animal musk. Her heart hammered so violently she was certain it would give her away. Pearl's tiny body trembled against her, but the puppy remained blessedly silent. The carriage dipped slightly. Someone was climbing in. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her lips to Pearl's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her only friend. Through the heavy fur, she heard the rustle of expensive fabric, the creak of leather as someone settled onto the seat above her. Then came a scent that cut through everything else. Rain-dampened wool, expensive brandy, and something darker. Something that smelled like winter winds across northern moors. The Duke of Ravenclife had entered his carriage. "Drive on," came a voice from above. It was deep, measured, and cold as the blade of a knife drawn in moonlight. The kind of voice that had ordered men into battle, that had silenced the House of Lords with a single syllable. The carriage lurched into motion. Beatrice bit down on her lip to keep from crying out as she was jostled against the floor. Pearl gave a tiny squeak. Above her, the Duke went utterly still. Beatrice's lungs burned. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She forced herself to release it slowly, silently. Perhaps he hadn't heard. Perhaps the sound of rain on the carriage roof and the rattle of wheels on cobblestones had masked Pearl's small noise. Perhaps, "You have precisely 3 seconds to reveal yourself," the Duke said softly, "before I assume you're an assassin and act accordingly." The words were calm, almost conversational, but Beatrice heard the steel beneath them. This was not a man who made idle threats. This was a man who had fought on the peninsula, who had killed in defense of the crown, who could snap her neck as easily as her aunt would snap Pearl's. Slowly, her entire body shaking, Beatrice pushed the fur rug aside and looked up. Even in the dim light of the carriage lamp, Alistair Burke was devastating. Tall enough that his head nearly brushed the ceiling, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire space. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from granite, and eyes the color of a winter storm. Those eyes were fixed on her now, with an intensity that made her feel pinned like a butterfly to a board. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. All her prepared explanations, her desperate pleas, withered under that merciless gaze. Then Pearl, with the innocent fearlessness of the very small and very loved, poked her white head out from Beatrice's arms and looked up at the Duke with bright, curious eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and the wheels and Beatrice's ragged breathing. The Duke's expression remained utterly unreadable. "Well," he said at last, his voice still carrying that dangerous softness, "this is unexpected." Alistair Burke had faced charging cavalry, assassins in the dark, and the viper's nest of Parliament without flinching. But the sight of the trembling girl on his carriage floor, clutching a white scrap of fur as though it were the only solid thing in the universe, gave him pause. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair escaping from what had once been an elegant arrangement. Her gown was expensive but ruined, torn at the hem, soaked through, and streaked with mud. But it was her eyes that held him, wide, dark, and filled with a terror so profound it bordered on animal panic. This was not a woman who had climbed into his carriage on a lark or as part of some society game. This was someone running for her life. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain." "I expect you will." Alistair settled back against the velvet seat, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The girl flinched at even that small motion, and something cold settled in his chest. He recognized that particular brand of fear. He'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers who'd been broken by cruel officers, in servants beaten by careless masters. "Begin with your name." "Beatrice." She swallowed hard. "Beatrice Halloway, Your Grace. I was, the niece of Lady Constance Ashworth." "Ah." That explained the quality of the gown and the desperation in equal measure. Alistair knew Constance Ashworth by reputation. A woman who collected orphaned relatives like trophies and displayed them at social functions to demonstrate her Christian charity, all while working them to the bone and treating them as unpaid servants. He'd watched her at the gala tonight, parading some pale girl around like a trained dog. And he'd felt the familiar contempt he reserved for society's most elegant cruelties. He studied the young woman before him with new understanding. You were at the Ashworth Gala tonight. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. The puppy in her arms chose that moment to stretch its small neck and yawn, revealing needle-sharp teeth and a pink tongue. The absurdity of the creature, no bigger than his hand, white and fluffy as a cloud, would have been comical under other circumstances. "And the dog?" he asked. At that, something shifted in Beatrice's expression. The terror remained, but beneath it rose something fiercer. "Pearl. Her name is Pearl, and she's mine. She's all I have, Your Grace, and my aunt." Her voice broke. She took a shuddering breath. "My aunt ordered her killed. Tonight. I heard the footman discussing how he would weight her body and throw her in the Thames." The words were delivered with a flatness that spoke of shock, but Alistair heard the anguish beneath. He'd developed a keen sense for truth during his years in military intelligence, and every instinct told him the girl was being honest. More than that, she was fracturing at the seams. "So you invaded my carriage?" He kept his voice neutral, watching her. Yes. Your Grace, I know it was wrong. I know I've committed a terrible—" She was spiraling now, the words tumbling out faster. "I'll accept whatever punishment you see fit. But please, please, if you could just let Pearl go. She's so small, she wouldn't survive on the streets. But perhaps someone kind might find her and— Miss Halloway." His sharp tone cut through her panic. She fell silent immediately, her eyes going even wider. Alistair gentled his voice just slightly. "I'm not going to hurt your dog." The relief that flooded her face was painful to witness. She clutched Pearl tighter, and the puppy let out a small sound of protest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Your Grace. If you could stop the carriage, I'll leave immediately. I'll take Pearl and we'll—" "Where?" The single word stopped her. She blinked at him. "Where will you go, Miss Halloway? It's past midnight. You're soaked through, you have no coat, and unless I'm mistaken, no coin either." He watched understanding dawn across her features, followed by a despair that made him want to find Lady Constance Ashworth and introduce her to the same Thames she'd planned for the puppy. "Did you have a plan beyond my carriage?" No. Her shoulders sagged. "I didn't think. I only heard them talking about Pearl, and I saw your carriage, and She looked down at the puppy in her arms. "I just couldn't let them take her." Alistair was quiet for a long moment, studying the girl before him. She was still shaking, her skin pale in the lamplight, and he could see the beginning of a bruise on her wrist where someone had grabbed her too hard. There were others, too, he suspected. The kind that were always carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and high necklines. He'd spent the last 5 years rebuilding his life around one simple principle. Emotional entanglements were liabilities. He'd buried that truth in blood and betrayal on the continent, and he'd structured his entire existence in England around maintaining absolute control. No weakness, no vulnerability, no one close enough to turn a knife in his ribs. And yet, there was something in the way this slip of a girl had risked everything for a creature that depended on her. Something in her fierce, foolish loyalty that reminded him of men he'd known. Good men, brave men, who'd given their lives for those who couldn't protect themselves. She'd climbed into the carriage of the most dangerous man in London without a second thought, armed with nothing but desperation and love. He respected that more than any calculated social maneuvering. "We're currently traveling north," he said finally, "toward my estate in Yorkshire, Ravenclife Manor." Her eyes widened. "Your Grace, I didn't mean to." "You must have urgent business. And I've already— Miss Halloway." He leaned forward slightly, pinning her with his gaze. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. Can you do that? She nodded, mute. Are you safe with your aunt? The question hung in the air between them. Beatrice's face went through a series of rapid transformations, surprise, fear, something that might have been hope, then a resigned acceptance that told him everything he needed to know, even before she spoke. No, Your Grace, she whispered. I don't think I am. Alistair nodded once, a decisive movement. Then you won't be returning to her. Not tonight. He saw her mouth open, saw the protest forming, and continued before she could speak. This is not a negotiation, Miss Holloway. You will come to Ravenclife as my guest. We will discuss the particulars of your situation once you've had food, dry clothes, and sleep. Do you understand? Your Grace, the scandal. Let me worry about scandal. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I assure you, I am far more frightening than any amount of gossip. It was true, and they both knew it. The Iron Duke's reputation was armor enough against society's arrows. No one would question his decisions. No one would dare. Beatrice stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her struggling with years of conditioning that told her not to trust, not to hope. Then Pearl yawned again, settling more comfortably in her arms, and something in the girl's expression softened. Thank you, Your Grace, she said quietly. Alistair inclined his head and settled back into his seat. The carriage rolled on through the rain, carrying them north toward Ravenclife and whatever came next. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted with unspoken things. Beatrice remained on the floor of the carriage, Pearl nestled in her arms, as though she couldn't quite believe she was permitted to stay. Alistair watched her from beneath lowered lashes, cataloging details with the precision that had kept him alive through 2 wars. She was shivering. Not just from cold, though her sodden gown certainly wasn't helping, but from shock. Her breathing was still too shallow, too quick, and her eyes kept darting to the carriage door as though expecting it to burst open and reveal her aunt's footman. The puppy seemed to sense her distress, burrowing closer and licking at her chin with determined affection. You can sit on the seat, Miss Holloway, Alistair said quietly. I won't bite. She looked up at him, startled, then down at herself as though only just realizing she was still huddled on the floor like a criminal. Yes, of course. Forgive me, Your Grace. She rose awkwardly, hampered by her wet skirts and her refusal to let go of Pearl. Alistair reached out instinctively to steady her elbow, and she flinched so violently that she nearly dropped the puppy. His hand froze in midair. The reaction was involuntary, visceral, and told him more than any words could. This wasn't simple nervousness around a duke. This was learned behavior, carved into her bones by repeated cruelty. He withdrew his hand slowly, keeping his movements predictable, the way one might approach a wounded animal. I apologize, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I should have asked permission. Beatrice's face flushed with mortification. No, Your Grace, that was unforgivably rude of me. You've been nothing but kind, and She was spiraling again. He could see it. Sit down, he said, more firmly this time. Before you fall down. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the seat opposite him, with Pearl in her lap. The puppy immediately began investigating the velvet upholstery with her nose, tail wagging with the oblivious joy of the very young. Despite everything, Alistair felt his mouth quirk slightly at the sight. How old is she? He asked, nodding toward Pearl. 4 months, Your Grace. Beatrice's voice softened when she spoke of the dog, losing some of its tremor. "I found her in the garden behind my aunt's house. Someone had left her in a basket by the kitchen door. She was so small, and it was raining, and she was crying." She stroked Pearl's head with a tenderness that made something in Alistair's chest constrict. "I couldn't leave her there." "Of course not." He watched the way her fingers moved through the puppy's fur, gentle and sure. "How did your aunt react?" Beatrice's hand stilled. "She said I could keep Pearl if I took on additional duties. The mending for the entire household, lessons for her youngest daughter, managing the correspondence with tradesmen." Her voice flattened. "She said a useless girl should at least make herself useful if she insisted on keeping a useless creature." Alistair's jaw tightened. "And tonight? What changed?" "Lord Pembroke." The name came out like something bitter. "He's an associate of my aunt's, a widower, nearly 60, with debts that would require a very particular sort of wife to manage." She looked down at Pearl. "My aunt decided I would suit his needs admirably. He came to dinner last week to meet me. He was..." She swallowed. "He was very interested in my compliance, in my understanding of a wife's duty to be silent and obedient." "And the dog would interfere with that," Alistair finished, his voice colder than the winter winds across his northern estate. "She said Lord Pembroke found Pearl's barking irritating, that a proper wife wouldn't keep pets that annoyed her husband." Beatrice's fingers had tightened in Pearl's fur, though she seemed unaware of it. The puppy bore it patiently, pressing against her. "The footman was to dispose of Pearl tonight, while I was at the gala. I was meant to be introduced to Lord Pembroke formally, to accept his suit. But I overheard them talking, and I..." "You chose the dog?" Alistair said softly. She looked up at him then, and for the first time since he'd discovered her, there was no apology in her gaze. "Every time, Your Grace. I would choose her every time. She's never asked me to be anything but myself. She doesn't care that I have no fortune, no connections, no beauty to recommend me. She loves me because I feed her and hold her when she's frightened, and that's..." Her voice broke. "That's more than anyone else has offered." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Alistair found himself studying her face with new attention. "No beauty to recommend her," she'd said. But that was objectively false. Even with her hair in disarray and her face pale with exhaustion, she had a loveliness that was all the more striking for being unconscious. High cheekbones, a stubborn chin, and those remarkable eyes that held depths of feeling most people spent lifetimes trying to hide. But beauty was irrelevant. What mattered was the steel beneath the softness, the loyalty that had driven her into a stranger's carriage, the fierce, protective love that radiated from her even now, exhausted and terrified as she was. "Let me see your wrist," he said abruptly. She blinked at him. "Your Grace?" "Your left wrist. The one you've been favoring since you stood up." Beatrice's free hand moved instinctively to cover the spot, but it was too late. He'd already seen the way she'd cradled it, the slight wince when she'd shifted position. After a moment's hesitation, she extended her arm toward him, setting Pearl gently aside. Alistair leaned forward, taking her hand with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his reputation. He pushed back the damp sleeve of her gown carefully, revealing the damage beneath. His expression didn't change. Years of military discipline had taught him to control his reactions. But inside, a cold rage was building. The kind he'd only felt on battlefields when he'd seen unnecessary cruelty inflicted on those who couldn't fight back. The bruises on her wrist were clear even in the dim carriage light, 4 distinct marks where fingers had gripped hard enough to leave purple shadows against her pale skin. They were at least a few days old, fading to yellow at the edges. But there were others too, older ones, half-healed, creating a map of violence across her forearm. "Your aunt?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "She doesn't like to be kept waiting," Beatrice said quietly. "Or contradicted. Or—" She trailed off, gently pulling her hand back and covering the bruises again. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters." Alistair sat back, his mind working through possibilities with cold precision. "Miss Holloway, I'm going to be very frank with you. Your aunt will come looking for you. She'll claim you've been kidnapped, or that you've run mad, or any number of things that will paint her as the concerned guardian and me as either a villain or a fool. The scandal will be considerable." He watched the hope drain from her face, watched her shoulders curve inward as though preparing for a blow. She reached for Pearl, gathering the puppy back into her arms like a talisman. "I understand, Your Grace," she whispered. "When we reach the next posting inn, I wasn't finished." His tone cut through her resignation. "The scandal will be considerable, but I am not sending you back. Not to her, and certainly not to Lord Pembroke." He leaned forward, catching and holding her gaze. "What I'm offering you, Miss Holloway, is a temporary truce. You will come to Ravenclife as my guest. We will give you time to heal, to think, to decide what you want for your future, without your aunt's hand on your wrist or her plans for your disposal. In return, you will trust that I mean you no harm. But the scandal will be managed." His lips curved into something sharp. "I am very good at managing things, Miss Holloway. Let that be my concern." He paused, then added more gently, "You've spent years being useful to people who saw you as a burden. Allow yourself to be useless for a while. You and your dog both." Beatrice stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for the trap, the price, the inevitable betrayal. He let her look. He had nothing to hide, at least not in this. Finally, she nodded. It was a small movement, tentative, but it was agreement. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier now. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." Alistair settled back into his seat, watching as exhaustion finally began to win its battle with adrenaline. "Try to sleep, Miss Holloway. We have several hours yet before we reach Ravenclife." She nodded again, curling into the corner of the seat with Pearl tucked against her chest. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep, and the puppy had followed suit, tiny paws twitching with dreams. Alistair gazed out the window at the rain-swept darkness, his mind already moving through strategies and contingencies. He'd told the truth. He was very good at managing things. But as he glanced at the sleeping girl across from him, at the bruises hidden beneath her sleeve, and the dog that represented everything she'd been willing to lose, he acknowledged something he rarely admitted even to himself. This wasn't about management. This was about mercy. And mercy, he'd learned long ago, was the most dangerous game of all. Dawn was breaking over the Yorkshire moors when the carriage finally turned onto the long drive leading to Ravenclife Manor. Beatrice stirred as the wheels crunched over gravel, Pearl immediately waking and stretching in her arms. The puppy's small yawn made Alistair's lips twitch despite his fatigue. "We've arrived," he said quietly, watching as Beatrice blinked sleep from her eyes and looked out the window. Her breath caught audibly. Ravenclife Manor rose from the landscape like something from a Gothic tale, all dark stone and severe lines against the gray morning sky, It wasn't the largest estate Beatrice had ever seen. Her aunt had dragged her to enough country house parties for comparison. But it was certainly the most imposing. Twin towers flanked the main entrance, their crenellations sharp as teeth against the clouds. Ancient oaks lined the approach, their bare branches reaching toward each other overhead like the rib cage of some massive beast. The effect should have been menacing. Instead, Beatrice felt something unexpected settle in her chest: safety. The house looked like exactly what it was: a fortress, a place that could keep the world at bay. "It's beautiful," she said softly, then flushed at her own boldness. "I mean, it's very impressive, Your Grace." "It's intimidating," Alistair corrected, his tone dry. "That's rather the point. My great-grandfather rebuilt it after the original manor burned down. He believed a man's home should announce his intentions clearly." He glanced at her, something almost like humor in his storm-gray eyes. In this case, the intention was, "Leave me the devil alone." Despite herself, despite everything, Beatrice felt a small smile tug at her lips. "It seems effective." "Remarkably so." The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, and Alistair was already moving, opening the door before the footman could reach it. He stepped down, then turned back to offer Beatrice his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, remembering her flinch from the night before, then carefully placed her free hand in his. His grip was steady and warm, his fingers curling around hers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the harsh lines of the manor behind him. He helped her down, and Pearl immediately began straining against Beatrice's hold, eager to explore this new territory. The front doors opened, and a woman emerged who could only be the housekeeper. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair tucked severely beneath a white cap and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes traveled from the Duke to Beatrice to the squirming puppy in her arms, and Beatrice watched the woman's expression shift from surprise to professional neutrality in the space of a heartbeat. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, dropping into a curtsy. "We weren't expecting you until next week." "Plans changed, Mrs. Blackwood?" Alistair gestured to Beatrice. "This is Miss Beatrice Holloway. She'll be staying with us as my guest. She'll need the blue room prepared, a hot bath drawn, and a full breakfast sent up within the hour." Mrs. Blackwood's gaze sharpened on Beatrice, taking in the ruined gown, the exhausted face, the protective way she held the dog. Something shifted in the housekeeper's expression. Not quite sympathy, but understanding. "Of course, Your Grace. And the—" She paused delicately. "Creature?" "Pearl," Beatrice said quickly, then bit her lip, realizing she'd spoken out of turn. But Mrs. Blackwood only nodded. "Pearl will need a basket and some scraps from the kitchen, I expect. Perhaps some old blankets for bedding." She looked at Alistair. "Shall I have her kept in the kennels, Your Grace?" "No." The word came from Beatrice before she could stop herself, sharp with panic. Pearl was not going into kennels, not where she couldn't see her, not after everything. "Please, "The dog stays with Miss Holloway," Alistair said calmly, cutting through her rising distress. "Whatever she needs, baskets, blankets, food, see that it's provided. Pearl is also a guest of this house." Mrs. Blackwood's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Very good, Your Grace. I'll see to it immediately." She turned to Beatrice, her voice gentling slightly. "If you'll follow me, Miss Holloway, I'll show you to your room." Beatrice looked back at Alistair, suddenly uncertain. In the carriage, enclosed in that small space, his protection had seemed solid and real. But here, in the vast emptiness of this Gothic manor, with servants appearing and disappearing like shadows, reality was reasserting itself. She was completely dependent on his goodwill. If he changed his mind, if he decided she was more trouble than she was worth, she had nowhere to go. No money, no connections, nothing but the ruined gown on her back and the puppy in her arms. As though reading her thoughts, Alistair stepped closer. Not close enough to crowd her, but near enough that she could see the exhaustion in his own features, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. He'd been traveling all night because of her, had taken responsibility for her without hesitation, and she had no idea why. "Miss Holloway," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I know you're frightened. I know you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, for me to reveal that this kindness comes with conditions or costs." He paused, holding her gaze. "It doesn't. You are safe here. I gave you my word in the carriage, and I don't break my word. Not to anyone, and certainly not to someone who risked everything to save a creature that depended on her." Beatrice felt her throat tighten. What if my aunt comes? "Then I will deal with your aunt." His voice didn't rise, but something in his tone made her believe him absolutely. "She will not take you from Ravenclife against your will. Do you understand me?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good." He stepped back, his expression returning to its usual controlled neutrality. "Get some rest. We'll talk more once you've recovered from the journey." Mrs. Blackwood led her into the manor, through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Burkes, who all seemed to share Alistair's uncompromising jaw and intense gaze. The Blue Room, when they reached it, was on the second floor, facing east. It was smaller than Beatrice had expected, more intimate than grand, with pale blue wallpaper and cream curtains that filtered the morning light into something soft and peaceful. "There's a dressing room through that door," Mrs. Blackwood said, moving efficiently about the room, checking the fire, adjusting the curtains. "I'll have Sally bring up some clothes for you. You're near enough her size that something should fit until we can arrange for a proper wardrobe. The bath will be ready within a quarter hour." She paused, looking at Beatrice with an expression that was almost kind. "His Grace is a good man, miss. Better than most know. You're safe here." Beatrice managed to smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, leaving Beatrice alone in the room. She set Pearl down carefully, and the puppy immediately began exploring, sniffing every corner with intense concentration. Beatrice moved to the window, looking out over the wild beauty of the moors, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She was miles from London, miles from her aunt, miles from Lord Pembroke and his cold assessment of her suitability as a silent, obedient wife. The isolation that should have terrified her felt instead like a gift, distance, space, time to breathe without someone's hand on her wrist. But the fear remained, coiled in her chest like a living thing. She didn't know how to trust this, didn't know how to believe that someone like the Duke of Ravenclife would protect her without wanting something in return. Everyone wanted something. That was the first lesson her aunt had taught her. Pearl trotted back to her, tail wagging, and Beatrice scooped her up. The puppy licked her chin enthusiastically, unconcerned with duchesses or scandals or the precarious nature of their situation. "We're safe," Beatrice whispered to her, testing the words. "He said we're safe." Pearl yapped softly in agreement, and Beatrice held her close, looking out at the gray sky and wondering if it was possible to trust in mercy when you'd spent so long learning that kindness always came with a price. Below, in his study, Alistair stared at the stack of correspondence that had accumulated in his absence and felt none of his usual drive to address it. Instead, his mind was full of bruised wrists and terrified eyes, of a girl who'd chosen loyalty over safety and a puppy who'd become her only friend. He'd told her the truth. She was safe at Ravenclife. He would make certain of it. What he hadn't told her, what he was only beginning to acknowledge himself, was that her safety had become important to him in a way that had nothing to do with duty or honor, and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that had surged through him when he'd seen those bruises. The Iron Duke, who had sworn never to let anyone close enough to matter, had apparently decided to make an exception. God help them both. 3 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Beatrice spent most of her time in the Blue Room, venturing out only for meals that were sent up on trays and brief walks in the enclosed garden behind the manor. She'd seen Alistair only in passing, a glimpse of his tall figure striding down a corridor, his voice drifting from behind the closed door of his study as he spoke with his steward. He was giving her space, she realized. Distance to recover, to adjust, to believe that his promise of safety was real. But the distance also meant uncertainty. Each day that passed without confrontation felt like borrowed time, and Beatrice found herself tensing at every footstep in the hall, every knock at her door. Pearl, at least, had adapted beautifully. The puppy had claimed the manor as her kingdom, prancing down corridors with her tail held high, charming even the most stoic footmen with her antics. It was Pearl who shattered the careful distance on the 4th morning. Beatrice had finally ventured beyond the gardens, drawn by the sound of piano music drifting from somewhere on the ground floor. She followed the melody through the corridors, Pearl trotting at her heels, until she found herself standing in the doorway of what was clearly the music room. Alistair sat at a massive grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with surprising grace. He'd removed his coat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. The piece he played was melancholy and beautiful, something by Beethoven, if Beatrice wasn't mistaken. She must have made some sound, because his hand stilled and he looked up, his gray eyes finding hers across the room. "Miss Halloway?" He didn't sound displeased, merely surprised. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No, I—" She clutched her hands together, suddenly aware that she was intruding. "I heard the music. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." He stood, and Beatrice's breath caught at the casual elegance of the movement. Without his coat and cravat, he looked younger, more approachable, almost human rather than the forbidding Duke of reputation. "I was just indulging myself. I don't often have the opportunity to play when I'm in London." "It was beautiful," Beatrice said softly. "I didn't know you played." "There are many things the gossips don't know about me, Miss Halloway. I prefer it that way." His lips quirked slightly. "Though I suspect by now, they know about you." The reminder of the scandal waiting for them in London made Beatrice's stomach clench. But before she could respond, Pearl had spotted something infinitely more interesting than human conversation. On a pedestal near the window sat a Chinese vase, blue and white porcelain that even Beatrice's untrained eye could identify as ancient and priceless. And next to the pedestal, a silk tassel hanging from the curtain tie, swaying gently in the breeze from the window. Pearl, with the single-minded determination of a puppy who'd spotted prey, launched herself at the tassel. "Pearl, no!" Beatrice started forward, but it was too late. The puppy's enthusiastic attack on the tassel caused her to jump, her back paws scrabbling against the pedestal. The vase wobbled. Time seemed to slow. Beatrice watched in horror as the priceless porcelain tipped, teetered, and fell. She heard her own sharp cry, saw Alistair move with startling speed, but neither of them was fast enough. The vase hit the floor with a sound like bones breaking and shattered into a dozen pieces. Pearl, startled by the noise, yelped and scrambled behind Beatrice's skirts. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stared at the shattered porcelain, her mind racing through calculations of cost and consequences. That vase had probably been worth more than everything she'd ever owned, combined. More than her aunt's plans to sell her to Lord Pembroke could have netted. It was the kind of destruction that warranted dismissal for a servant. And she wasn't even a servant. She was a charity case. An uninvited guest who'd brought chaos into the Duke's ordered world. "Your Grace, I am so sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I'll pay for it. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. She was already moving, dropping to her knees to gather the pieces, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them. "Please, I didn't mean..." Pearl didn't understand. "Miss Halloway." His voice was calm, but she barely heard it over the roaring in her ears. "I'll work. I can take a position somewhere. I'll send you everything I earn until it's repaid." A sharp edge of porcelain bit into her palm, and she gasped, dropping it. Blood welled from the cut, bright red against her pale skin. "Beatrice." The use of her given name cut through her panic. She looked up to find Alistair crouched beside her, his expression unreadable. "Stop. You're bleeding. The vase is a vase." He took her hand gently, examining the cut with a frown. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely. "It can be replaced. Your hand cannot." He produced a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it against her palm, his larger hand enfolding hers. "And for God's sake, stop apologizing." Beatrice stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. But it must have been worth £800 at auction, according to my father's inventory. Alistair said it as calmly as if he were discussing the weather. "Ming Dynasty, gifted to my great-grandfather by an ambassador. Quite rare." £800. Beatrice felt dizzy. She'd be working for years, decades, to repay such a sum. "Your Grace, It was also," he continued, his tone taking on a hint of something that might have been amusement, "the single ugliest thing in this room. I've wanted to be rid of it since I inherited the estate. But my mother assured me it was too valuable to simply give away." He glanced at Pearl, who was peeking out from behind Beatrice's skirts with cautious eyes. "It appears your dog has saved me from a lifetime of looking at it." Beatrice blinked. "You're not angry?" "With you?" "No." He kept his hand wrapped around hers, maintaining gentle pressure on the cut. "With the puppy? Certainly not. She's 4 months old and doing what puppies do." He met her gaze, and something in his expression softened. "Beatrice, do you know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head mutely. "I see someone who spent so long being punished for things that weren't her fault, that she can't distinguish between a genuine accident and a crime." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture unconscious and gentle. "A broken vase is nothing. Less than nothing. It's porcelain and paint and the pretentious taste of a dead ancestor. Your safety, your peace of mind, those are what matter here." "I don't understand," she whispered. "In my aunt's house, if I broke something, this is not your aunt's house." His voice hardened slightly, though his touch remained gentle. "And I am not your aunt. Here, you are allowed to make mistakes. You are allowed to exist without perfection. You are allowed to breathe." He paused, then added more softly, "So is Pearl." As if summoned, the puppy ventured out from hiding and approached Alistair cautiously. He released Beatrice's hand long enough to scratch Pearl behind the ears, his large fingers gentle on her small head. The puppy's tail began to wag tentatively. "See," he said. "No one is angry with you, little one. Though perhaps we should keep you away from pedestals for a while." Beatrice felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen and tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she said again. But this time it was for the tears, not the vase. "Don't be." Alistair produced another handkerchief. How many did the man carry? And offered it to her. "Cry if you need to. Rage if you need to. This is your home now, for as long as you need it. And you're allowed to feel things here. Your home." The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and impossible. Beatrice took the handkerchief and pressed it to her eyes, trying to regain some composure. When she finally looked up, Alistair was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, only a fierce protectiveness that she was beginning to recognize and, terrifyingly, to trust. "Thank you," she managed. "For everything. For the vase. For Pearl. For—" She gestured helplessly around the room, unable to find words for the sanctuary he'd given her. "You don't need to thank me for basic decency, Beatrice." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. This time she took it without hesitation. "Now, let's get that cut properly cleaned, and then perhaps you'd like to hear the rest of the Beethoven? I promise I'll warn Pearl away from any other priceless artifacts." As he led her from the music room, calling for Mrs. Blackwood to bring bandages and to have someone clear up the porcelain, Beatrice felt the last of her careful defenses begin to crumble. She'd spent 4 days waiting for the Duke of Ravenscliff to transform into something cruel, to reveal that his kindness had limits and conditions. Instead, she was beginning to suspect something far more dangerous, that his kindness might be real, and that she was already halfway to losing her heart to the man they called the Iron Duke. The evening found them in the library, a room that had quickly become Beatrice's favorite. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of volumes, and a fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the worn leather furniture. Pearl was curled in a basket near the fire, her small body rising and falling with the deep breaths of puppy sleep. Beatrice sat in a wing chair with a book of poetry she wasn't really reading, too aware of Alistair's presence on the opposite side of the fireplace. He'd been working through correspondence, his pen scratching steadily across paper for the better part of an hour. But now he'd set the pen aside and was staring into the flames with an expression that made something in Beatrice's chest tighten. He looked haunted, she thought, like a man watching ghosts dance in the fire. "Your Grace?" The words were out before she could stop them. "Are you well?" He glanced at her, seeming to return from somewhere very far away. "Alistair," he said quietly. "When we're alone like this, please call me Alistair. Your Grace makes me feel ancient." "That wouldn't be proper," Beatrice said. But her voice lacked conviction. Propriety seemed a distant concept in this room, with the fire warming them and the darkness pressing against the windows. "Propriety fled the moment you climbed into my carriage, Beatrice." His use of her name still sent a flutter through her stomach. "I think we're well past such concerns now." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I was thinking about something you said, about Pearl being the only one who loved you without conditions." Beatrice set down her book, her full attention on him now. "Yes, I understand that," he said softly. "More than you might think." He leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Would you like to know why they call me the Iron Duke, Beatrice? The real reason, not the gossip?" She nodded, hardly daring to breathe. "I was engaged once," he began, his voice carefully neutral in a way that told her the neutrality cost him. "Her name was Catherine Thornberry. We'd known each other since childhood. Our estates bordered one another. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duke could want in a wife. I was 23 and foolish enough to believe that history and affection were the same as love." Beatrice's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. She could already sense where this was going, could hear the pain beneath his controlled tone. "We were to be married after I returned from the peninsula. I was serving with Wellington, and Catherine wrote to me faithfully every week. Her letters were—" He paused, something flickering across his face. "They were everything to me in that hell. Proof that there was something beautiful and untouched waiting for me at home, something worth surviving for." Pearl stirred in her sleep, making a small sound. Alistair's gaze drifted to the puppy, and Beatrice saw his expression soften for just a moment before hardening again. "I was injured at Salamanca," he continued. "Took a saber to the ribs that should have killed me. It was months before I was well enough to travel, and Catherine's letters became less frequent. I told myself she was busy with wedding preparations, that she missed me as much as I missed her. His laugh was bitter. "I was remarkably naive." "What happened?" Beatrice asked, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to hear whatever had carved that emptiness into his voice. "I came home unannounced, wanting to surprise her. I went directly to her family's estate." He was staring into the fire again, his jaw tight. "I found her in the garden, with my cousin, Edmund. They were—" He stopped, and Beatrice saw his hands clench. "She was wearing the locket I'd sent her from Spain, the one that had cost me 3 months' pay. And she was kissing him as though I'd never existed." "Oh, Alistair." His name slipped out without thought, carrying all the compassion she felt. "She hadn't been planning to tell me," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "She'd intended to marry me as planned, secure the title and the fortune, and continue her affair with Edmund in secret. She only confessed because I caught them. Do you know what she said when I confronted her?" Beatrice shook her head, her throat tight. "She said I'd been gone too long, that she'd needed someone, and Edmund had been there. That I was a fool to expect her to remain faithful when I'd chosen to go play soldier." His lips twisted. "She said loyalty was a luxury, not a promise. That everyone betrayed everyone eventually. It was simply a matter of time and opportunity." "That's not true," Beatrice said fiercely. "That's not— People aren't all like that." "Aren't they?" He looked at her then, and the rawness in his gaze made her want to cross the room and do something utterly inappropriate, like take his hand or touch his face. "Edmund was my closest friend, Beatrice. We'd grown up together, fought together. I trusted him with my life. And Catherine—" He exhaled slowly. "I'd loved her. Or I thought I had. But what I loved was the idea of her, the image she'd presented in those letters. The real woman was a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a title to be secured." "So you became the Iron Duke," Beatrice said softly, understanding now. "You made yourself untouchable." "I made myself safe," he corrected. "I swore I would never again allow anyone close enough to betray me. No emotional attachments, no vulnerability, no trust. Just duty and honor, and the cold comfort of control." He ran a hand through his dark hair, disheveling it. "It worked remarkably well. For 5 years I've been exactly what they call me. Iron, unbending, unfeeling, unmoved by anything resembling sentiment. "And then I climbed into your carriage," Beatrice whispered. "And then you climbed into my carriage." His gaze locked with hers across the firelight. "Do you know what I saw that night, Beatrice? I saw a girl who'd risked everything, her safety, her reputation, her future, for a creature that depended on her. No calculation, no weighing of advantage. Just absolute, unshakable loyalty to something she loved." His voice roughened. "I'd forgotten that kind of loyalty existed. That kind of love." Beatrice felt tears prickling her eyes. "It was just Pearl. Just a puppy." It was everything. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his intensity pinning her in place. "Don't you see? In a world where people like Catherine and your aunt treat loyalty as a commodity to be traded, where love has conditions and costs, you chose to protect something helpless at the cost of everything you had. That's not just anything, Beatrice. That's the rarest thing I've ever encountered." "You did the same," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You protected us. Me and Pearl both. You didn't have to, but you did. Because I recognize something in you." He held her gaze, and Beatrice felt the air between them charged with something electric and dangerous. "I recognize the person I used to be, before Catherine taught me that trust was foolish. And I thought—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I thought perhaps if I could keep you safe, if I could prove that sanctuary without conditions was possible, then maybe the world wasn't entirely composed of betrayers and the betrayed." "You're not iron," Beatrice said, the certainty of it ringing through her. "You never were. You're just wounded." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "We're both wounded," he said quietly. "The difference is, you haven't let it make you cruel. Neither have you." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. Pearl woke and stretched, then trotted over to Beatrice, who scooped her up automatically. The puppy's warm weight was grounding, real, a reminder of why she was here. "Thank you," Beatrice said finally, "for telling me, for trusting me with this." "You trusted me with your life," Alistair said simply. "It seemed only fair to trust you with my history." He stood, and Beatrice felt the loss of the moment like a physical ache. "It's late. You should rest." She rose as well, cradling Pearl. "Alistair?" He paused at the door, looking back at her. "What Catherine said, about loyalty being a luxury, about everyone betraying everyone, she was wrong." Beatrice met his eyes steadily. "Some people keep their promises. Some people are worth the risk of trusting them." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was softer than she'd ever seen on his face. "Good night, Beatrice," he said quietly, and left her standing by the fire, her heart racing and her mind full of shadows and firelight and the terrible, wonderful realization that she was falling in love with a man who'd spent 5 years teaching himself not to feel. But she'd seen beneath the iron tonight. She'd seen the wound and the man who bore it with dignity rather than bitterness. And she thought perhaps, if she was very careful and very brave, she might convince him that loyalty without conditions wasn't just something dogs offered. It was something she could offer too. The week that followed felt suspended in time, like a dream that Beatrice was afraid to wake from. The fear that had gripped her since London began to ease, replaced by something she barely recognized: contentment. Each morning, she woke in the blue room to Pearl's enthusiastic kisses and the knowledge that no one would hurt them today. Each evening, she fell asleep with a book in her hands and the sound of the wind across the moors outside her window. And every day, there was Alistair. It began simply enough. The morning after their conversation in the library, he'd found her in the garden watching Pearl chase butterflies through the overgrown rose beds. He'd offered to show her the rest of the grounds, and she'd accepted, grateful for his company in a way that should have alarmed her, but somehow didn't. "My mother planted these," he said as they walked past beds of lavender that filled the air with their scent. Pearl bounded ahead of them, a white blur of energy. She said every fortress needed something beautiful to remind its inhabitants why they were fighting. Beatrice touched one of the purple blooms gently. "She sounds wise." She was. His voice carried a wistfulness she'd never heard before. "She died when I was 15. Fever. My father followed within the year. I think he simply didn't want to be in a world without her." "That's terrible," Beatrice said softly. "And beautiful. To love someone that much. Terrifying, more like." But there was no heat in his words. He looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. To need another person so completely that their loss unmakes you entirely? That's the kind of vulnerability I spent years avoiding. And now? The question was bold. Probably too bold. But Beatrice found she needed to know. He was quiet for a long moment, watching Pearl dig enthusiastically in a flower bed. "Now I'm beginning to wonder if avoiding vulnerability isn't just another form of surrender." They walked on, and Beatrice felt something shift between them. Some invisible barrier thinning like morning mist in sunlight. The next day, he appeared at breakfast with a proposition that made her eyes widen. "You should learn to ride," he announced, as though this were the most natural suggestion in the world. What?" Beatrice set down her teacup with a clatter. "Your Grace, I've never, that is, my aunt considered such things unsuitable for Alistair," he corrected gently. "And your aunt considered many things unsuitable that were, in fact, perfectly reasonable. The moors are beautiful on horseback, and you should see them properly." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Besides, Pearl has been terrorizing the stable cats. Perhaps a daily ride would tire her out." That was how Beatrice found herself in the stable yard an hour later, dressed in a borrowed riding habit that Mrs. Blackwood had produced with remarkable efficiency. The mare Alistair led out was a gentle dappled gray named Moonlight, with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. "She's beautiful," Beatrice breathed, approaching cautiously. "And unflappable," Alistair added. "She was my mother's favorite. I can't think of a better horse for a first lesson." He demonstrated how to offer Moonlight an apple, his hand guiding Beatrice's until the mare took it gently. "There. You're friends now." Learning to ride was harder than Beatrice had imagined. Her muscles protested, her balance was precarious, and she felt certain she would tumble off at any moment. But Alistair was patient in a way she'd never expected. His instructions clear and encouraging, his hand steadying her when she wobbled. "Don't grip with your knees quite so hard," he said, one hand on her ankle, adjusting her position in the stirrup. "Think of it as a conversation between you and the horse. You're partners, not adversaries." "Easy for you to say," Beatrice muttered, but she was smiling. "You're not the one who might end up in the dirt." "I fell off my first horse 17 times, he said solemnly. "My father kept count. He said it built character." She looked down at him, surprised. You? The Iron Duke fell off a horse 17 times? The Iron Duke was once a boy who couldn't stay in a saddle to save his life. His gray eyes held warmth and something that might have been mischief. Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation. Your secret is safe with me, Beatrice promised, and felt her heart swell with the intimacy of it. This small confession, this glimpse of the boy he'd been before loss and betrayal, had carved him into something harder. By the third day, she could walk moonlight around the paddock without assistance. By the fifth, they ventured onto the moors themselves, Alistair on his massive black stallion, Dante beside her. Pearl had been left in Mrs. Blackwood's capable care, much to the puppy's vocal displeasure. The moors stretched endlessly in every direction, wild and windswept and breathtaking. Purple heather dotted the landscape, and the sky seemed impossibly vast, unmarred by the smoke and crowds of London. Beatrice felt something in her chest expand, as though there was finally room for her to breathe properly. "It's magnificent," she said, pulling moonlight to a stop on a rise that overlooked the valley. Alistair drew up beside her, his eyes scanning the landscape with the ease of long familiarity. "It's home," said simply. "The only place I've ever felt truly free." He glanced at her. "Does it frighten you? The isolation?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "In London, I was surrounded by people and felt alone. Here, She struggled for the right words. "Here, I feel seen." Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. "You are seen, Beatrice. Perhaps more than you realize." The wind picked up, pulling strands of her hair free from their pins. Alistair reached out without thinking, tucking them gently behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, so natural, that Beatrice forgot to breathe. His hand lingered for a moment, his fingers just brushing her cheek, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression before he pulled back. "We should head back," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Mrs. Blackwood will have tea ready, and Pearl will have destroyed something else by now." But neither of them moved immediately. They sat there on the rise, the wind singing around them, the moors spreading wild and free beneath the gray sky. And Beatrice thought she'd never been happier in her entire life. The evenings developed their own rhythm. After dinner, they would retreat to the library, sometimes reading in comfortable silence, sometimes talking about everything and nothing. Alistair told her about his time in the peninsula, about the men he'd served with and the impossible decisions of war. Beatrice found herself sharing stories from her childhood, before her parents died, when life had been full of laughter and possibility. "My father used to take me to the shore," she said one night, curled in her usual chair with Pearl dozing in her lap. "We'd search for shells and build castles in the sand. He said every person needed a castle of their own, even if it was just made of sand and dreams." "He sounds like a good man," Alistair said quietly. "He was." Beatrice smiled at the memory, bittersweet but no longer painful. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said the best people were the ones who'd been broken and chose to mend themselves rather than break others." "Is that what you think I'm doing?" There was something vulnerable in the question. "Mending?" She looked at him across the firelight, this man who'd saved her without hesitation, who'd shown her patience and kindness when she'd expected neither, who'd shared his wounds and trusted her with his truth. "I think we're mending each other," she said softly. The silence that followed was full of unspoken things. Alistair's gaze held hers, and Beatrice saw in his eyes what she felt in her own heart. This fragile, terrifying, wonderful thing growing between them. Too precious to name, yet too powerful to ignore. "Beatrice," he began. then stopped. She saw him struggle with something, saw the war between his careful control and whatever he was feeling. Finally, he simply said, "I'm glad you climbed into my carriage that night." "So am I," she whispered. The week passed like water through fingers, precious and fleeting. Beatrice knew it couldn't last, that eventually the world would intrude, that her aunt or scandal or simply reality would shatter this perfect sanctuary they'd built. But for now, riding across the moors with Alistair beside her, reading by the fire while he worked at his desk, teaching Pearl not to chase the stable cats while he watched with barely concealed amusement. For now, this was enough. More than enough. It was everything she had never known she needed. And when she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart race, when his hand lingered on hers a moment too long, when his voice softened in that particular way that felt like a caress, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he felt it too. This thing between them that had no name yet, but felt like coming home. The peace shattered on the 8th morning. Beatrice was in the garden with Pearl, watching the puppy investigate a particularly interesting patch of earth, when she saw Alistair striding toward her from the house. Even at a distance, she could read the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. Her contentment evaporated like morning dew, replaced by the old familiar dread. "What's happened?" she asked as he drew near. He held out a folded newspaper without preamble. This arrived from London with the Morning Post. Beatrice took it with trembling fingers. The headline seemed to leap off the page. "Duke of Ravenscliffe implicated in mysterious disappearance." Beneath it, in smaller print, "Lady Ashworth claims niece kidnapped from London gala." The words blurred as Beatrice scanned the article. Her aunt's quotes were masterful, carefully calibrated to paint her as a distraught guardian and Alistair as either a villain or a fool. "My poor Beatrice was last seen fleeing the Ashworth gala in a state of distress," Lady Ashworth was quoted as saying. "We believe she may have been taken against her will by persons unknown. The Duke of Ravenscliffe's carriage departed at precisely the same time, and he has refused all correspondence since. One can only draw the most alarming conclusions." "She's lying," Beatrice said, her voice hollow. "She knows exactly what happened. She ordered Pearl killed, and I know." Alistair's voice was calm, but she could hear the steel beneath it. "And she knows I know. This isn't about truth, Beatrice. It's about control. She's lost her hold on you, and she's attempting to force you back through public pressure." Beatrice looked up at him, fear clawing at her throat. "If people believe her, if they think you kidnapped me, your reputation is mine to risk." He moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "I won't send you back to her, Beatrice. Not for scandal, not for gossip, not for anything. But the House of Lords, your standing in society," she gestured helplessly at the newspaper. "She's made it sound like I was abducted, like you're holding me against my will. If she brings charges, then I'll defend against them." His hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture so natural now it no longer startled her. "Look at me. Do you trust me?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "Then trust that I can handle your aunt." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she saw something fierce in his gray eyes. "She's counting on me being too concerned with propriety to fight back. She's counting on me valuing my reputation more than your safety. She doesn't know me at all." A carriage was coming up the drive. Beatrice spotted it over Alistair's shoulder, her stomach dropping. "Are you expecting someone?" He turned, his expression darkening. "No, but I suspect I know who it is." He lowered his hand from her face, but caught her fingers instead, squeezing gently. Stay close to me. Whatever happens, you're safe. I promise you that. The carriage bore the Ashworth crest. Beatrice felt her breath leave her body as it rolled to a stop before the house. The door opened, and her aunt emerged in a swirl of black silk, followed by a man Beatrice recognized with a sickening lurch, Lord Pembroke, the widower her aunt had chosen as her future husband. Lady Ashworth was tall and imposing, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of ice. She'd always reminded Beatrice of a bird of prey, beautiful in a harsh way, always watching for weakness. Lord Pembroke was exactly as Beatrice remembered, 60 years old at least, with cold eyes and a mouth that suggested cruelty disguised as discipline. Your Grace. Lady Ashworth's voice carried across the garden, pitched to convey both relief and reproach. Thank heavens. We've been beside ourselves with worry. My poor niece. She caught sight of Beatrice, and her expression shifted to something that might have passed for maternal concern if one didn't know her. Beatrice, darling, you're safe. When you disappeared from the gala, we feared the worst. Alistair's hand tightened on Beatrice's. Lady Ashworth, Lord Pembroke, this is unexpected. Unexpected? Lady Ashworth's voice rose an octave, a calculated display of distress. Your Grace, my niece has been missing for over a week. The entire city is in an uproar. Surely you can understand our concern. Miss Halloway is not missing, Alistair said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. She is here, under my protection, as my guest. Your guest? Lord Pembroke spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a sneer. An unmarried young woman, alone with a bachelor, for over a week? Your Grace, surely you understand how this appears. I understand perfectly how it appears, Lord Pembroke. What I don't understand is why that should concern you. Beatrice felt rooted to the spot, watching the scene unfold with a dreamlike horror. Her aunt's gaze had found her now, really found her, and the rage beneath the false concern was palpable. Beatrice, come here at once, Lady Ashworth commanded, her voice sharp. We're leaving immediately. This entire situation is deeply inappropriate, and no. The word came from Beatrice before she could think, propelled by a week of safety and the memory of Alistair's hand in hers. I'm not going with you. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Pearl seemed to sense the tension, pressing against Beatrice's skirts with a small whimper. Lady Ashworth's expression turned glacial. I beg your pardon? I said no. Beatrice's voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. I won't go back with you. I won't marry Lord Pembroke. I won't. Her courage faltered under her aunt's withering stare, years of conditioning screaming at her to submit, to apologize, to obey. Then she felt Alistair's presence at her back, solid and unwavering, and something in her straightened. Miss Halloway is of age, Alistair said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She is not your property, Lady Ashworth, nor your prisoner. If she chooses to remain at Ravenclife, that is entirely her decision. She is my ward, Lady Ashworth hissed, the pretense of concern dropping away. Her parents left her in my care, and I have legal authority. Your legal authority extends to her inheritance, nothing more. And that only until she marries or reaches the age of 25. Alistair's voice was deadly calm. Would you like me to have my solicitor explain the law to you, or shall we continue this fascinating display of concern that materialized only after the newspapers became involved? Lord Pembroke stepped forward, his face mottled with anger. Your Grace, this is highly irregular. Miss Halloway was promised to me. Lady Ashworth and I had an arrangement. An arrangement to which Miss Halloway was not a party, Alistair interrupted, and which has no legal standing whatsoever. He moved to stand beside Beatrice, his presence a wall between her and the two people who'd tried to control her life. Let me be very clear. Miss Halloway is under my protection. She will remain at Ravenclife for as long as she wishes. Any attempt to remove her against her shall be met with the full force of my considerable resources and influence. Do I make myself understood? This is outrageous. Lady Ashworth's composure was cracking, fury seeping through. The scandal alone will ruin her. Ruin you both. No decent family will receive her after this. She'll be safe, Alistair said flatly, which is more than I can say. She would be under your roof. Lady Ashworth's eyes narrowed, and Beatrice saw calculation replace rage. You think your title protects you from consequences, Your Grace? You think society will simply accept this arrangement? Her gaze raked over Beatrice with contempt. An unmarried girl living in your home? They'll call her your mistress. They'll say she seduced you, that she's a fortune hunter who trapped the Iron Duke with false tears and... Careful. Single word from Alistair carried such menace that Lady Ashworth actually stepped back. You're speaking of my guest. Show her the respect she deserves, or I'll have you removed from my property. This isn't over, Lady Ashworth said, her voice venomous. I'll go to the magistrate. I'll petition the House of Lords. I'll see to it that every door in London is closed to you both. And you, Beatrice? Her gaze fixed on her niece with pure malice. You'll come crawling back within a month, begging for my forgiveness. And when you do, there will be no mercy, no second chances. Then it's fortunate she won't be crawling back, Alistair said. Good day, Lady Ashworth, Lord Pembroke. I trust you can see yourselves out. For a moment, Beatrice thought her aunt might actually strike her. But Lady Ashworth merely smiled, cold and predatory. Enjoy your little sanctuary while it lasts, Beatrice. The world will have its reckoning soon enough. She swept back to the carriage, Lord Pembroke following with a final venomous look at Beatrice. They departed in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving silence in their wake. Beatrice realized she was shaking. Alistair turned to her immediately, his hands coming to her shoulders, steadying her. Breathe, he said softly. You're safe. She's gone. She'll come back, Beatrice whispered. She'll find a way. She always finds a way. Then I'll be ready. He pulled her closer, and Beatrice let herself lean against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. Beatrice, I need you to understand something. What I said to her, I meant every word. You're not going back. Not to her, not to Lord Pembroke, not to any life you don't choose for yourself. But the scandal is a problem I can solve. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Trust me. Please. She nodded, though fear still coiled in her stomach. Her aunt had never been one to accept defeat gracefully, and Beatrice knew this was far from over. But as Alistair led her back toward the house, Pearl trotting faithfully at her heels, she felt something else beneath the fear. Hope. And the fierce, desperate wish that the man beside her might be strong enough to keep his promise. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ravenclife's entrance hall as Alistair stood at the window, watching the second carriage approach in as many hours. This one was grander than the first, polished to a mirror shine and accompanied by outriders in Ashworth livery. His jaw tightened. Lady Ashworth was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and she'd clearly decided to escalate. Beside him, Beatrice had gone pale, her fingers twisted so tightly in Pearl's fur that the puppy squirmed in protest. He could feel the fear radiating from her in waves, could see the years of conditioning warring with the fragile confidence she'd begun to build during her time at Ravenclife. "She's brought reinforcements," Beatrice whispered, her voice hollow. "That's Sir Edmund Fairfax's carriage behind hers. He's a magistrate and he owes my aunt favors." Her breathing was becoming shallow, rapid. "Alistair, if she has legal documents, if she's convinced him that I need to be returned to her care, then he'll learn that legal documents mean very little when faced with a duke who has no intention of surrendering." Alistair turned to her, catching her chin gently to make her meet his eyes. "Beatrice, look at me. Whatever happens in the next hour, remember this. You are not alone. You are not the frightened girl in your aunt's house anymore. And I will not let her take you." The carriages rolled to a stop. Alistair watched as Lady Ashworth emerged first, her black silk rustling with calculated elegance. Behind her came Sir Edmund Fairfax, a portly man in his 60s, with the self-important bearing of someone who enjoyed wielding what little power he possessed. And finally, a man Alistair recognized with a cold settling in his chest, Lord Pemberton, a member of the House of Lords and a notorious gossip who would ensure whatever happened here today would be all over London by nightfall. "She's making this public," he said quietly. "She wants witnesses, wants to force my hand through social pressure." "Will it work?" Beatrice's voice was barely audible. "No." He took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "But it will be unpleasant. Can you bear it?" She nodded, though he could feel her trembling. Pearl, sensing her distress, licked at her wrist and whined softly. Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. "Your Grace, Lady Ashworth and her party are requesting an audience. She says it's a matter of legal urgency. Show them into the drawing room." "And Mrs. Blackwood?" Alistair's voice dropped. "Have Thomas ready the carriage, just in case." The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly, understanding the implication, then nodded and withdrew. Alistair offered Beatrice his arm, feeling her hand tremble as she placed it on his sleeve. "Remember," he said softly as they walked toward the drawing room, "you are under my protection. That means something in this world, even to women like your aunt." The drawing room had been designed by his mother to be welcoming. All cream walls and soft furnishings meant to gentle the harsh northern light. But the moment they entered, the space felt like a battlefield. Lady Ashworth stood by the fireplace in a position of deliberate dominance, flanked by her allies like a general with her troops. She dressed for war in severe black, her gray hair arranged in an elaborate style that added inches to her already imposing height. "Your Grace." Her voice was cold enough to freeze fire. "How good of you to finally grant us an audience. I trust you've had time to consider the gravity of your actions." Alistair settled Beatrice into a chair near his own, noting how she clutched Pearl like a talisman. He remained standing, using his height to full advantage. "Lady Ashworth." "Gentlemen, I confess I'm uncertain what actions you're referring to. Miss Halloway has been my guest at Ravenclife, which hardly constitutes a crime." "Your guest?" Sir Edmund Fairfax's jowls quivered with indignation. "Your Grace, surely you understand the impropriety of an unmarried young woman residing in a bachelor's household without a chaperone. It's simply not done." "Mrs. Blackwood has served as chaperone," Alistair said coolly. "My housekeeper is beyond reproach, as is her presence in this household." "A servant is hardly an adequate chaperone for a young lady of quality," Lord Pemberton interjected, his voice dripping with false concern. "The scandal alone, Your Grace. Think of Miss Halloway's reputation." "I am thinking of Miss Halloway." Alistair's voice hardened. Which is more than can be said for those who would force her into an unwanted marriage with a man twice her age. Lady Ashworth's expression flickered just for a moment before settling back into cold disdain. How dramatic. Your Grace has been listening to my niece's fancies, I see. Beatrice has always had an unfortunate tendency toward hysteria and exaggeration. It's a failing I've tried to correct, but she remains emotional. Beatrice flinched at the familiar criticism, and Alistair felt rage coil in his chest. He'd seen this tactic before, the casual dismissal of a woman's words as hysteria, the implication that her very emotions rendered her unreliable. Miss Holloway has shown nothing but rationality and courage in my presence, he said, his tone like cut glass. If you wish to call her hysterical, Lady Ashworth, you'll need to provide evidence beyond your own convenient assertions. The evidence is the situation itself. Lady Ashworth's composure cracked slightly. She fled my home in the middle of a gala, stole away in your carriage like a common thief, and has been living here in scandal ever since. If that's not evidence of an unbalanced mind. She fled because she overheard your footman discussing how he intended to drown her dog. Alistair interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. Wait it proper, I believe were his exact words. The Thames don't give up what it takes. The silence that followed was absolute. Sir Edmund cleared his throat uncomfortably. Even Lord Pemberton looked taken aback. That is an outrageous accusation, Lady Ashworth said. But something in her voice had shifted. My niece's attachment to that creature was always excessive. I may have suggested that a dog was inappropriate for her station, but to suggest I would have it killed. You ordered it killed. Beatrice's voice cut through the room, quiet but steady. Alistair felt pride surge through him as she stood, still clutching Pearl, but with her chin raised and her dark eyes blazing. I heard Jonathan discussing it with the other footman. You told him to dispose of Pearl before the morning, before Lord Pembroke came to finalize the betrothal arrangements. You said no man would want a wife who valued a dog more than her duty. Beatrice, your imagination, is not imagining the bruises on her wrist. Alistair's words fell like stones. Or the ones on her arms, or the way she flinches when someone raises their voice. He looked at Sir Edmund and Lord Pemberton, letting them see the cold fury in his gaze. Gentlemen, I'm not a fool. I know what I'm looking at when I see a young woman who's been systematically brutalized by someone who was supposed to protect her. How dare you? Lady Ashworth's mask had finally shattered, revealing the vicious anger beneath. How dare you stand there and accuse me of brutality when you're the one who's compromised my niece's reputation beyond repair? You've ruined her, Your Grace. Whether through seduction or simple thoughtlessness, you've made her unmarriageable to any decent man. Then it's fortunate I have no intention of allowing her to marry an indecent one. Alistair moved to stand beside Beatrice, his presence a wall between her and her aunt. Miss Holloway is under my protection, my absolute protection, and she will remain so for as long as she wishes. Your protection? Lady Ashworth's laugh was ugly. What protection can you offer against the judgment of society, against the House of Lords? Lord Pemberton, surely you see that the Duke is being manipulated by a calculating girl who's trapped him into... I see a young woman holding a puppy, Lord Pemberton said slowly, his gaze on Beatrice thoughtful, and a Duke defending her with rather more passion than the situation would seem to warrant. He looked at Alistair. Your Grace, are your intentions toward Miss Holloway honorable? The question hung in the air. Alistair felt Beatrice go very still beside him, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. This was the trap, the corner Lady Ashworth had been maneuvering him toward. Either admit his intentions were dishonorable and lose all moral authority, or propose marriage and be seen as forced into it by scandal and manipulation. But as he looked at Beatrice, at the fierce, loyal, wounded girl who'd risked everything for a creature that depended on her, he realized the trap had no teeth. Because the answer was simple, and it had been since the moment he'd found her trembling on his carriage floor. My intentions toward Miss Halloway are to ensure she is safe, happy, and free to choose her own future, he said clearly. If that future includes remaining at Ravenclife as my guest until she determines what she wishes to do with her life, then that is what will happen. If it includes marriage to anyone of her choosing, then I will support that decision. What it will not include is a return to an environment where she was starved, beaten, and forced to watch as the only living thing that showed her love was murdered for convenience. You're risking everything for her, Sir Edmund said quietly. Your reputation, your standing in the House of Lords, your position in society, all for a girl you've known barely more than a week. Yes, Alistair's voice was utterly calm. I am. Lady Ashworth stared at him, calculation replacing fury in her ice-chip eyes. You'll regret this, Your Grace. Both of you. I'll see to it that every door in London is closed to you. Every family of quality will know that the Iron Duke was brought low by a manipulative little. I suggest you leave now. Alistair's voice cut through her words like a blade. Before I forget that you're a woman and treat you with the same courtesy I'd offer any bully who threatens someone under my protection. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lady Ashworth swept toward the door, her allies following with varying degrees of reluctance. But she paused in the doorway, looking back at Beatrice with pure venom. This isn't over, Beatrice. You'll come crawling back within a month, begging for mercy. And when you do, I'll make certain you understand the price of defiance. She won't be back, Alistair said quietly. And Lady Ashworth? If you attempt to contact Miss Halloway again, if you spread lies about her in society, if you so much as speak her name in anything but the most respectful terms, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that your own position in society becomes untenable. I can be very creative when motivated, and you've motivated me considerably. Lady Ashworth's face went white with rage, but she had no response. She turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like thunder. When the front door finally closed behind them, Beatrice's legs gave out. Alistair caught her, lowering her gently back into the chair as Pearl yapped with concern. She was shaking violently, tears streaming down her face, but when she looked up at him, there was wonder mixed with the fear. You did that for me, she whispered. You risked everything. I did what was right. He knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. And Beatrice? I would do it again, 1,000 times over. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched his face, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you for being the one person who kept me safe. And in that moment, kneeling before her in his drawing room, with Pearl squeaking between them and the threat of scandal hanging over their heads like a sword, Alistair Burke realized something terrifying and wonderful. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his heart, and this fierce, loyal, broken girl had demolished every single one, without even trying. The days after Lady Ashworth's departure settled over Ravenclife like snow. Quiet, transformative, and somehow crystallizing everything that had been forming between them. Beatrice found herself moving through the manor with a new kind of freedom, as though Alistair's public declaration of protection had finally severed the invisible chains her aunt had wound around her heart. But There was something else now. Something that made her breath catch when she found him watching her across the breakfast table. Something that turned the air electric when their hands brushed as he helped her from her horse after their daily rides. The distance he'd maintained so carefully, the control that had defined the Iron Duke, was fraying at the edges. She felt it too. This pull between them that had nothing to do with protection or duty, and everything to do with the way her heart raced when he smiled, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the way they'd both stopped pretending this was merely a temporary sanctuary. It was Pearl, predictably, who forced the moment into being. 5 days after the confrontation, Beatrice was in the library, her favorite room, with its smell of old leather and wood smoke, when Pearl began her most enthusiastic investigation yet of the lower shelves. The puppy had grown bolder in her explorations, and Beatrice had learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that meant Pearl was getting into trouble. She found the little dog nose deep in a portfolio of what appeared to be architectural drawings, her tail wagging with the joy of discovery. Papers were scattered across the carpet in a chaos of ink and parchment. "Pearl, no!" Beatrice lunged forward, scooping up the puppy just as Alistair entered the library. He took in the scene, the scattered papers, Beatrice's mortified expression, Pearl's unrepentant face, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, but something softer, almost amused. "I'm so sorry," Beatrice began, already kneeling to gather the papers. "She's been so good lately, I didn't think. These look important. I'll make sure they're all." "They're plans for the East Wing renovation," Alistair said, kneeling beside her. His shoulder brushed hers, and Beatrice felt her breath catch. "My father started it before he died. I've been meaning to finish it for years." He picked up one of the drawings, studying it with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'd planned to turn it into a nursery. When I married Catherine, I thought..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "You'd need rooms for children," Beatrice finished softly. "Yes." He set the paper down carefully. After everything ended, I put the plans away. Told myself there was no point in finishing something for a future that would never happen." Beatrice's heart ached at the grief in his voice, the old wound laid bare. "And now?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her forget to breathe. "Now I'm beginning to think I put away more than just architectural plans." The library suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Beatrice was acutely aware of how close they were, of the way the firelight caught the angles of his face, of Pearl squirming in her arms as though sensing the importance of this moment. "Alistair," she began, but he shook his head. "Let me say this, Beatrice. I need to say it before I lose my courage, which is something I never thought I'd have to worry about until I found you hiding beneath a wolfskin rug." His lips quirked, but his eyes remained serious. "When I discovered you in my carriage that night, I thought I was rescuing someone in distress. I thought I was simply doing what any decent man would do. But you weren't looking to be rescued. You were saving yourself, saving Pearl, making the impossible choice between safety and love, and choosing love without hesitation." "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "I couldn't let them hurt her." "You had every choice." His hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture so gentle it made her eyes sting. "You could have left Pearl behind and saved yourself. You could have accepted your aunt's plans, married Lord Pembroke, lived a safe if miserable life. But you didn't. You chose loyalty over security, chose love over survival, and that..." His voice roughened. That changed something in me I thought was broken beyond repair. Beatrice leaned into his touch, her free hand coming up to cover his. You weren't broken. You were just wounded. There's a difference. I built walls, Beatrice. For 5 years, I built walls around anything that could hurt me. Told myself that control and distance were the same as strength. And then you climbed into my carriage with nothing but a puppy and a fierce heart. And every single wall I'd built started to crumble. I didn't mean to. I know. He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter, like the man he might have been before betrayal taught him to guard his heart. That's what makes it perfect. You didn't try to breach my defenses or manipulate your way past my control. You just existed. Loyal and brave, and so desperately deserving of someone who would protect you the way you protected Pearl. And somewhere in these past 2 weeks, I stopped being the man who saved you and became the man who can't imagine his life without you in it. Beatrice's vision blurred with tears. Alistair, what are you saying? I'm saying I love you. The words came out rough, honest, like they'd been torn from somewhere deep. I love your fierce loyalty and your gentle heart. I love the way you look at the moors like they're a gift. The way you've learned to ride like you were born to it. The way Pearl follows you everywhere because she knows your safety and home and love all wrapped together. I love that you chose her over everything. And I love that you're teaching me how to choose love over fear. I love you too, she breathed, the words spilling out like a confession. I tried not to. Tried to keep my distance because I was so afraid you'd change your mind, that this was all temporary. But every day you showed me kindness without conditions, safety without a price, and I fell more in love with you than I thought possible. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, and Beatrice felt the tremor that ran through him, this strong, controlled man, undone by emotion. Pearl, squeezed between them, let out a small sound of protest, and they both laughed, the sound shaky and joyful. There's something I need to ask you, Alistair said, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with scandal or reputation or saving you from gossip. It has everything to do with the fact that 2 weeks ago, my carriage was empty. My life was empty. I was going through the motions of existence without actually living. And I'd convinced myself that was enough. That safety and control were worth more than love. And now, her voice was barely a whisper. Now I know better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple gold with a single emerald that caught the firelight. This was my mother's. My father gave it to her when he proposed, and she wore it every day until she died. She used to say it reminded her that love was like the stone, multifaceted, able to catch light even in darkness, strong enough to last forever if you handled it with care. Beatrice stared at the ring, her heart thundering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Beatrice Holloway, Alistair said, and his voice was steady now, certain, like a man who'd finally found his way home. Will you marry me? Not because of scandal or duty, or because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine another morning without you across the breakfast table, another ride without you beside me, another evening without you curled up in that chair reading while Pearl destroys something priceless. Marry me because you've taught me that walls are just another form of prison, and I want to be free with you. The tears were falling now, hot and fast, and Beatrice couldn't stop them. Pearl was licking frantically at her face, confused by the salt and the emotion. But all Beatrice could see was Alistair, this magnificent, wounded, brave man who'd risked everything to keep her safe and was now offering her everything in return. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked with joy. "Yes, Alistair. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, the emerald gleaming against her skin like a promise. Then his hands were cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and he was kissing her with a gentleness that made her sob into his mouth. It was nothing like she'd imagined a first kiss would be. There was no practiced seduction, no calculated passion. Just honesty and tenderness and the overwhelming sense of coming home to a place she hadn't known existed. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Pearl had wiggled free and was investigating the architectural plans with renewed interest. "We should probably stop her before she redesigns the entire East Wing," Beatrice said, laughing through her tears. "Let her." Alistair pulled her close, tucking her against his chest, and Beatrice felt his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her cheek. "We'll need those nursery plans after all, for Pearl's inevitable offspring and whatever other creatures you decide to rescue." "And children?" she asked shyly. "Someday?" "Someday," he agreed, his voice warm with promise. "As many as you want. We'll fill this fortress with life and laughter and love, and it will never be empty again." Beatrice tilted her head back to look at him, this man who'd become her sanctuary and her home. "You saved me," she said softly. "No." He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "You saved yourself. I just had the privilege of keeping you safe while you learned to trust that safety could be real." His arms tightened around her. "You saved me too, Beatrice. From a life half-lived, from walls I'd built so high I'd forgotten what light looked like. You and that ridiculous puppy showed me that loyalty and love weren't weaknesses to be feared. They were the only things worth fighting for." Pearl chose that moment to yap triumphantly, having successfully shredded one of the architectural drawings. They both looked at the damage, then at each other, and dissolved into laughter that echoed through the library like music. Later, when Mrs. Blackwood found them sitting on the floor surrounded by scattered papers, Pearl asleep in Beatrice's lap and Alistair's arm around her shoulders as they planned their future together, the housekeeper smiled knowingly and quietly closed the door. The Iron Duke had finally melted, she would tell the staff later. And it was about time, because Ravenclife Manor had been waiting for its Duchess. And the girl with the white puppy and the fierce heart was exactly what they'd all been hoping for. My sweet family. The Iron Duke risked his entire reputation and his seat in the House of Lords to prove that mercy is worth more than status. Beatrice finally found her sanctuary, but in the real world, stories like hers are often silenced by people like Lady Ashworth. Don't let the bullies win. If you believe that loyalty should always be rewarded, subscribe and share this video to show the world that we stand with the vulnerable. If you leave without liking, you're letting Lady Ashworth have the last word. Don't let her win. Click that button and join the Duke in his stand for justice. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.